At precisely 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the ramp of a Higgins boat dropped onto the sand at Omaha Beach. Inside were 30 men from Company A, 117th Infantry Regiment. Most of them came from Bedford, Virginia, a small town of about 3,000 people. These men had grown up together, gone to school together, worked together. Now they were about to fight together. Within 10 minutes of that ramp dropping, 19 of Bedford's sons would be dead or dying in the surf. Company A was not alone. In the span of just 1 hour, between 6:30 and 7:30 that morning, nearly 2,000 American soldiers would be killed, wounded, or listed as missing on a stretch of French coastline less than 6 miles long. This beach, codenamed Omaha, would become the bloodiest sector of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. And for 60 terrible minutes, as machine gun fire tore through landing craft and German artillery turned the surf red with blood, the entire outcome of World War II hung in the balance. This is the story of that hour, not the sanitized version you might have seen in history books, but the moment-by-moment reality of what happened when thousands of young Americans waded into the teeth of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The story of how the plan failed almost instantly, how the bombardment missed its targets, how most of the tanks sank before reaching shore, and how the soldiers who survived did so not because of strategy or firepower, but because of something far more fragile and far more powerful: the simple human refusal to give up. What you're about to hear will take you through each stage of that first hour, from the dark crossing of the English Channel to the desperate climb up the bluffs above Omaha Beach. You'll learn why Allied intelligence failed to detect the presence of a veteran German division. You'll discover how 13,000 bombs completely missed their targets. You'll follow individual soldiers through moments of terror and extraordinary courage. And at the end, you'll understand a truth that the survivors themselves only realized years later: that the greatest amphibious invasion in history came within minutes of total catastrophe. Let's go back to the night before, to the English Channel on June 5, 1944, where thousands of men were crossing dark waters toward a beach most of them would never leave. The night before. The English Channel had never been kind to sailors, and on the night of June 5, 1944, it showed no mercy to the thousands of young men crossing its dark waters. Picture yourself there, in the belly of a landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder with 30 other soldiers. The boat pitches and rolls. Cold spray crashes over the sides. The smell of diesel fuel mixes with vomit. Based on survivor accounts collected in the decades after D-Day, we know that some men prayed, repeating familiar verses learned in childhood churches. Others wrote what they called just-in-case letters, tucking them into waterproof pouches. A few attempted sleep, though veterans later reported that genuine rest proved nearly impossible when facing the dawn assault on what intelligence briefings had described as the most heavily defended beach in Hitler's Atlantic Wall. This was the reality for the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions as they crossed from England toward the Normandy coast. They had trained for months practicing beach landings on the shores of southern England, climbing mock obstacles, studying maps and aerial photographs until they could navigate every sector of Omaha Beach in their minds. Dog green, dog white, dog red, easy green, easy red, fox green. These code names would soon be etched into history, synonymous with one of the bloodiest mornings of World War II. The convoy stretched for miles across the channel. More than 1,000 vessels moved through the darkness, from massive battleships and cruisers down to the small landing craft that would carry the infantry to the shore. The organization required to coordinate this armada was staggering. Every ship had its position, its timing, its role in the great symphony of invasion that General Dwight D. Eisenhower had set in motion. Operation Neptune, the naval component of the larger Operation Overlord, represented the culmination of years of planning, the hopes of millions of enslaved Europeans, and the combined military might of the Allied nations. For the soldiers in those landing craft, however, the grand strategy mattered less than immediate concerns. Post-war interviews with veterans reveal the questions that cycled through their minds. Would the naval bombardment destroy the German bunkers? Would the tanks make it to shore? Would their officers survive long enough to lead them off the beach? Decades later, survivors would describe these thoughts as constant, almost mechanical, as the night wore on and the coast of France drew closer. The weather had nearly derailed everything. General Eisenhower had postponed the invasion by 24 hours due to storms that swept across the channel on June 4th. His meteorologists predicted a brief window of slightly better conditions on the 6th. It was not ideal, far from it, but waiting another 2 weeks for the next suitable tide cycle was unthinkable. The Germans would have more time to strengthen their defenses. The secrecy of the operation would be harder to maintain. Most critically, the soldiers already aboard ships and prepared for battle would suffer psychologically from another delay. Eisenhower made the decision that would define his legacy. The invasion would proceed at dawn on June 6, 1944. Now, as darkness gave way to the first gray light of morning, the men could see the French coastline emerging from the gloom. It looked peaceful from a distance. This stretch of sand and cliffs that the Germans called Widerstands Nest 62 and the Allies called Omaha Beach. But everyone aboard those landing craft knew that behind that peaceful facade waited the concentrated firepower of one of the most formidable defensive positions ever constructed. The soldiers checked their weapons again. They adjusted the heavy loads on their backs, 60 pounds or more of ammunition, rations, grenades, equipment. Some carried extra mortar rounds. Others had flamethrowers or Bangalore torpedoes for clearing obstacles. The assault engineers bore particularly heavy burdens, weighted down with explosives needed to blast through the beach obstacles and German fortifications. Every man had been assigned a specific task, a specific objective. The plan was detailed and precise. Everything had been accounted for, everything prepared. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And at Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944, the plan would disintegrate within minutes of H-hour, leaving thousands of men to fight, not according to careful strategy, but according to instinct, courage, and the desperate human will to survive. The naval bombardment began at 5:50 a.m. The sound was tremendous, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very sea. Battleships USS Texas and USS Arkansas opened fire with their main guns, sending massive shells screaming toward the German positions. Cruisers added their voices to the barrage. The men in the landing craft felt a surge of confidence. Surely nothing could survive such firepower. Surely the Germans would be dead or demoralized by the time the infantry reached the shore. They were wrong. The strategic context Omaha Beach was never supposed to be the hardest landing. When Allied planners selected the 5 beach sectors for Operation Overlord in 1943, they understood that each would present challenges. Utah Beach to the west was backed by flooded fields and marshes. The British and Canadian beaches to the east, Gold, Juno, and Sword, faced different terrain and defensive arrangements. But Omaha, a crescent of sand roughly 6 miles long between the villages of Vieilleville-sur-Mer and Colleville-sur-Mer, represented a particular problem. The beach itself was only part of the obstacle. Behind it rose bluffs up to 30 meters high, steep slopes covered with grass and scrub. These bluffs provided natural defensive positions, offering German defenders commanding fields of fire across the entire beach. Only 5 narrow draws, or valleys, cut through the bluffs, providing potential exits for vehicles and troops. The largest and best was at Vieilleville, where a paved road ran down to the beach. The others were dirt tracks, barely suitable for jeeps, let alone tanks and trucks. The German defensive philosophy under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was clear: defeat the invasion at the waterline. Rommel had seen what Allied air power could do in North Africa and Italy. He knew that once Allied forces established a substantial foothold on the continent, once they could bring their overwhelming material superiority to bear, Germany would lose. The only chance was to crush the invasion before it could consolidate, to throw the Allies back into the sea while they were most vulnerable, in those critical hours when men waded through surf and climbed across exposed beach. To implement this philosophy, the Germans had spent years fortifying the Normandy coast. They built concrete bunkers, housing artillery pieces, some capable of firing directly onto the beach, others positioned to provide enfilading fire along the length of Omaha. They constructed pillboxes for machine guns, positioning them to create interlocking fields of fire where every inch of sand could be covered by bullets. They dug trenches connecting these positions, allowing defenders to move under cover. They laid mines, hundreds of thousands of them, both on the beach and in the bluffs beyond. The beach obstacles represented German engineering at its most diabolical. Starting about 250 yards out from the high water mark, 3 bands of obstacles waited to rip apart landing craft or detonate mines attached to their frames. The outermost band consisted of Belgian gates, heavy iron frames on rollers designed to tear the bottoms out of boats. Closer in came rows of wooden stakes and logs, many topped with mines. Finally, nearest to shore, stood the hedgehogs, welded steel rails arranged in crossing patterns like massive jacks. When the tide rose, many of these obstacles would be hidden beneath the water, invisible death traps for coxswains trying to navigate their landing craft to shore. Allied intelligence had done remarkable work identifying these defenses. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the beach from various angles. Agents of the French resistance provided ground-level information. British commandos had even conducted raids along the Norman coast, bringing back sand samples to ensure that the beach could support tanks. By May 1904, Allied planners believed they understood what awaited at Omaha Beach. But they made one critical error, an intelligence failure that would cost hundreds of American lives in the first hour of the invasion. The Allies knew that the coastal defenses at Omaha were manned by elements of the German 716th Infantry Division. This was a static division, formed primarily of older soldiers and foreign conscripts, many of them Russians and Ukrainians, who had been captured on the Eastern Front and given the choice of service in German uniform or death in POW camps. Intelligence estimated the 716th at about half strength, with perhaps 800 to 1,000 men defending the Omaha sector. These troops were not expected to put up particularly fierce resistance. What Allied intelligence missed, despite having identified it just 2 days before D-Day, was that the entire defensive structure at Omaha Beach had been reorganized. Field Marshal Rommel had ordered the 352nd Infantry Division forward from its positions around St. Lo, 20 miles inland. Unlike the 716th, the 352nd was a full-strength combat-ready division. It numbered approximately 12,000 men, of whom 6,800 were experienced combat troops. Many had fought on the Eastern Front. They were well-trained, well-led, and highly motivated. In March 1944, the 352nd had taken over responsibility for defending a 33-mile stretch of coast that included Omaha Beach. 2 battalions of the 352nd's Grenadier Regiment 916 were now dug into the bunkers and trenches overlooking the beach. Additional units from the 726th Regiment of the 716th Division remained in place, now under the operational command of the 352nd. This meant that instead of facing a reinforced battalion of questionable quality, the Americans would be assaulting positions held by battle-hardened veterans supported by artillery from the 352nd Artillery Regiment. The information about this redeployment had reached Allied intelligence on June 4th, passed up through channels to Falcor's headquarters and the 1st Infantry Division. But it arrived too late to change the fundamental plan. Ships were already loaded, men already briefed, the intricate choreography of the invasion already in motion. Commanders were informed, but the assault would proceed as designed. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, was told about the presence of the 352nd Division. He later wrote that he was shaken to discover they had gone into Omaha with such a thin margin of safety. But by then, there was no turning back. The men in the landing craft knew none of this. They believed they were facing a weakened, demoralized enemy. They expected the naval and air bombardment to neutralize most of the German defenses. They anticipated that specially modified tanks would swim ashore ahead of them, providing covering fire. They trusted in the plan, in their training, in their leaders. They did not know that they were about to wade into the teeth of one of the strongest German divisions in France. As the landing craft circled in the assembly area, waiting for the signal to begin their run to shore, naval gunfire continued to pound the coast. Sailors in the fire control stations of battleships and cruisers watched their shells explode on the bluffs. Surely, they thought, nothing could survive this bombardment. But the German bunkers were built of reinforced concrete, meters thick in places. The guns that could penetrate such defenses were the heavy naval rifles, but even they needed direct hits to destroy a bunker. Most shells were falling in open areas, cratering the landscape, but leaving the fortified positions largely intact. The aerial bombardment had been even less effective. Before dawn, 448 B-17 bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force had flown over Omaha Beach, carrying 13,000 bombs meant to obliterate the German defenses. But the bombers faced a critical problem. Heavy cloud cover obscured their targets. Bombardiers could not see the beach clearly through their sights. Under strict orders not to risk hitting the approaching landing craft with premature drops, the bomber crews delayed their release by seconds. Those seconds meant that virtually all 13,000 bombs fell inland, behind the German positions, doing no damage to the beach defenses. When the smoke cleared, the bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery positions remained operational, their German crews shaken but alive and ready to fight. This failure of the preliminary bombardment would prove catastrophic. The entire Allied plan for Omaha Beach rested on the assumption that overwhelming firepower would suppress or destroy the German defenses before the infantry landed. Without that suppression, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions would have to fight their way across a heavily defended beach under direct fire from positions that should have been neutralized. It would require a level of courage and sacrifice that no training could fully prepare them for. As H hour approached, 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the stage was set for one of the most brutal battles in the history of warfare. Thousands of young Americans were about to step into a maelstrom of steel and death. Most would survive, but hundreds would not. And in that first terrible hour, the outcome of the entire invasion would hang in the balance. German defenses and the 352nd Division, Major Werner Pluskat, stood in his observation post above Omaha Beach as dawn broke on June 6th. An artillery forward observer for the 352nd Infantry Division, Pluskat had spent the night at Resistance Nest 60, one of the fortified positions on the eastern flank of the beach sector. Now, as the first light revealed the English Channel, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Ships. Not a few ships, but hundreds of them, stretching from horizon to horizon. He grabbed his field telephone and called his divisional headquarters. The invasion had begun. The 352nd Infantry Division had arrived in Normandy only months before, formed in November 1943 from the remnants of units destroyed on the Eastern Front. Under the command of Generalleutnant Dietrich Kreis, the division had been rebuilt, trained, and designated for eventual return to combat in Russia. But the threat of Allied invasion in the West changed those plans. In March 1944, as Rommel pushed to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, the 352nd was ordered forward to take over coastal defense responsibilities. Unlike many German divisions stationed in France, the 352nd was not a second-rate occupation force. It retained its full complement of 9 infantry battalions, organized into 3 grenadier regiments: the 914th, 915th, and 916th. This was unusual for 1944, when most German infantry divisions had been reduced to 6 battalions due to manpower shortages. The division also included its own artillery regiment, anti-tank battalion, engineer battalion, and reconnaissance unit. On paper, if fully manned, the 352nd should have numbered about 17,200 men. In reality, by June 1944, it had approximately 12,000 soldiers, of whom 6,800 were combat infantry. The men of the 352nd came from various backgrounds. Some were veterans of the Eastern Front hardened by combat against the Soviet Army. Others were younger soldiers born in 1926, conscripted in late 1943, and given intensive training through the winter and spring. They were not fanatics, not elite troops, but they were competent, well-led, and fighting from prepared positions. That combination would prove formidable. Generalleutnant Kreis faced a challenge. His division was responsible for defending a 33-mile stretch of coast, far beyond what German tactical doctrine considered prudent. The solution was to concentrate forces at the most likely landing points and organize a mobile reserve that could respond to threats. 2 regiments, the 914th and 916th, were positioned forward. The 915th was held back as a counterattack reserve southeast of Bayeux, several miles inland. At Omaha Beach itself, the defensive layout reflected careful German planning. The beach was divided into sectors, each sector built around a strongpoint, or Widerstands nest. These strongpoints numbered WN60 through WN74, from east to west, were the backbone of the defense. They were not single bunkers, but rather complexes of interconnected positions designed to support each other with overlapping fields of fire. WN62, roughly in the center of Omaha Beach, above the draw leading to Colleville, was the strongest position. It occupied a prominent piece of ground on the bluffs with an excellent view of the beach. The position included emplacements for 2 75mm guns, 2 50mm anti-tank guns, 2 50mm mortars, and multiple machine gun nests, including an MG-34 on an anti-aircraft mount. The garrison numbered about 35 men from the 352nd Division and the 726th Regiment. One of those men was Private Heinrich Severloh, a 20-year-old who would spend 9 hours on June 6th firing his MG-42 machine gun at the waves of Americans below. WN-60, at the eastern end of the beach, near the Cobourg Draw, was positioned on high cliffs with a commanding view. It housed artillery pieces capable of engaging both the beach and ships offshore. WN-65 in the center above the Colleville Draw included a 75mm gun in a concrete casemate, multiple machine gun positions, and an extensive trench system. WN-72 at Vierville, on the western end, controlled the most important exit from the beach, the paved road through the draw. It was heavily fortified with multiple bunkers and surrounded by minefields. Between the major strongpoints, the Germans had constructed numerous other defensive positions: simple machine gun nests in the bluffs, mortar pits, observation posts, anti-tank ditches. These positions were connected by communication trenches, and in some cases by underground tunnels, allowing defenders to move without exposing themselves to fire. Telephone lines linked the positions to command posts further back, enabling coordinated fire and rapid response to changing tactical situations. The weaponry deployed at Omaha was varied and deadly. Artillery included captured French 75mm and 88mm guns, German 50mm anti-tank guns, and mortars of various calibers. The total inventory included over 60 light artillery pieces in the Omaha sector. 8 of the heaviest guns were housed in concrete casemates, reinforced bunkers that could withstand all but direct hits from the largest naval shells. 4 guns were in open positions, protected only by sandbags and earthworks, but still effective. 35 pillboxes housed lighter weapons, primarily machine guns and anti-tank guns, The machine guns represented perhaps the greatest threat to infantry crossing open ground. The Germans deployed both the MG-34 and the newer MG-42. The MG-42 was particularly fearsome, capable of firing up to 200 rounds per minute with a distinctive ripping sound that American soldiers described as being like cloth tearing, only much louder. With 85 machine gun positions scattered along and behind Omaha Beach, German gunners could saturate the sand with bullets. They had pre-registered fields of fire, specific zones assigned to each gun to ensure complete coverage of the beach. The Germans also deployed multi-barrel rocket launchers called Nebelwerfers. These weapons could launch 6 rockets in rapid succession, creating devastating barrage fire across large areas. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. The distinctive shriek of incoming Nebelwerfer rockets terrified soldiers caught in the open. Supporting these coastal defenses, the 352nd Artillery Regiment had positioned batteries of 105mm and 150mm howitzers further inland. These guns could not engage targets directly on the beach due to their positioning, but they could fire on the approaches on ships offshore and on troops attempting to move inland. The regiment had carefully plotted firing solutions for various targets, allowing for rapid and accurate barrages. The soldiers manning these positions in the early hours of June 6th were tired but alert. They had been on alert status for weeks, anticipating an invasion that intelligence suggested was imminent. Some had dozed at their posts. Others had written letters home or played cards to pass the time. When the naval bombardment began at 5:50 a.m., it jolted them fully awake. Those in the most exposed positions huddled in the deepest parts of their bunkers as shells screamed overhead and exploded around them. The concrete walls shook. Dust and debris filled the air. Communication lines were cut in some sectors. But when the bombardment lifted at 6:30 a.m., as the first landing craft approached the beach, the German soldiers emerged from their shelters and took up firing positions. They saw the sea covered with boats, hundreds of them, small craft packed with men. The American infantry were still 200, 300, sometimes 400 yards from shore, completely exposed, with nowhere to hide. For the German machine gunners, it was almost too easy. They simply aimed at the approaching boats and fired. Every burst was certain to find targets in those densely packed craft. Lieutenant Bernhard Furking, commanding the garrison at WWII 62, later described the moment. The landing craft looked like toys on the water, but he knew they carried men about to die. He felt no personal animosity toward those Americans, but he had his orders. He had his position to defend. And defend it he would, with everything at his disposal. The German commanders, from divisional headquarters down to the individual strongpoint leaders, understood that this was the critical moment. If they could stop the invasion at the beach, if they could inflict such heavy casualties that the Americans could not consolidate a foothold, then victory might be possible. If the Americans broke through, if they climbed the bluffs and penetrated inland, then the 352nd Division, like all of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, would eventually be overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. German after-action reports and post-war interrogations suggest what followed. Soldiers checking weapons, stacking ammunition within easy reach, looking through gun sights at the approaching boats. And when the Americans came within a few hundred yards of shore, when the first wave of infantry entered effective range, the Germans opened fire with everything they had. American forces and planning. The 1st Infantry Division had landed in North Africa in November 1942, fought through the Tunisian campaign, assaulted the beaches of Sicily in July 1943, and waded ashore at Salerno in Italy 2 months later. Known as the Big Red One after its distinctive shoulder patch, the division had more combat experience than any other American division in the European theater. Its soldiers were veterans. Many of its junior officers and NCOs had survived multiple battles. When Eisenhower and Bradley selected divisions for the assault on Omaha Beach, the 1st Infantry Division was the obvious choice to lead on the eastern half. Major General Clarence R. Hubner commanded the division, a tough, demanding officer who believed in thorough preparation and strict discipline. Under his command on D-Day, the division would put ashore 2 regimental combat teams: the 16th Infantry Regiment on the eastern sectors of Omaha Beach, Easy Red and Fox Green, and elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment from the 29th Infantry Division on the western sectors. The 29th Infantry Division was a National Guard unit activated in 1941, composed primarily of men from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Unlike the battle-hardened 1st Division, the 29th had never seen combat, but it had trained extensively in England since arriving in October 1942, practicing amphibious assaults, live-fire exercises, and small unit tactics. Major General Charles H. Gerhardt commanded the division, though for D-Day, operational control of elements landing at Omaha would fall under the 1st Division's command structure. The 117th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division was assigned the western half of Omaha Beach, the Dog sectors and Easy Green. This regiment had historical lineage back to the famous Stonewall Brigade of the Civil War, and its soldiers took pride in that heritage. On June 6th, Company A of the 116th would have the dubious honor of landing on Dog Green, the westernmost sector of Omaha Beach, directly in front of some of the strongest German positions. The assault plan called for the infantry to land in waves, beginning at H-hour, 6:30 a.m. The first wave would consist of 8 infantry companies, approximately 1,450 men, divided among the various sectors. They would be carried ashore in Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, LCVP, small boats that could hold about 30 men each. These Higgins boats, as they were commonly called after their designer, had a simple layout: a rectangular hull with a ramp at the front that would drop down to let soldiers rush out into the surf. Each assault company was organized into specially equipped sections. These sections had specific tasks. Some would attack designated strong points, others would clear obstacles, still others would move inland to secure the draws leading off the beach. The soldiers carried heavy loads. A rifleman typically bore about 60 pounds of equipment: weapon, ammunition, grenades, rations, first aid kit, gas mask, though gas attacks never materialized, entrenching tool. Officers carried maps, radios, and signal devices. Medics had their aid bags packed with bandages, morphine, and plasma. Engineers bore demolition charges for destroying obstacles and bunkers. The plan depended on several key elements working correctly. First, the aerial and naval bombardment would destroy or neutralize most German defenses. Second, special DD tanks would swim ashore 5 minutes before the infantry, providing immediate fire support. Third, engineer teams would clear 16 gaps through the beach obstacles within the first 30 minutes, allowing vehicles and follow-on waves to move freely. Fourth, the infantry would quickly cross the beach, scale the bluffs, and secure the draws, opening routes for armor and vehicles to move inland. If all went according to plan, by 9 a.m. the beach defenses would be cleared, by noon the draws would be open to traffic, and by the end of D-Day, American forces would have established a beachhead 8 miles deep, linking up with British forces landing to the east at Gold Beach and American forces to the west at Utah Beach. Omaha Beach would become a logistics hub, with supplies and reinforcements flowing ashore to support the advance inland. The Rangers added another dimension to the assault. The 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, elite light infantry units modeled after British commandos, had trained specifically for D-Day missions, requiring special skills and exceptional courage. 3 companies of the 2nd Rangers, Force A under Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, were assigned to assault Pointe du Hoc, a prominent cliff 3 miles west of Omaha Beach. German intelligence indicated that 6 155mm guns were positioned there, capable of firing on both Omaha and Utah beaches. These guns had to be neutralized, and Rudder's Rangers would scale 100-foot cliffs under fire to do it. The remaining Rangers would land on Omaha Beach itself. If Rudder succeeded at Pointe du Hoc and sent the success signal by 7 a.m., the other Rangers would follow him there. If no signal came, they would land at Dog Green and fight across the beach with the 116th Infantry Regiment. This plan put the Rangers at the disposal of whichever mission needed them most. Tank support would come from 2 battalions, the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions. Each battalion had been equipped with special amphibious Sherman tanks called DD tanks for duplex drive. These remarkable vehicles had a waterproof canvas screen that could be raised around the tank, held up by inflatable tubes and metal struts. With the screen up, the tank could float. Twin propellers mounted on the rear provided propulsion through water, allowing the tank to swim from landing craft to shore. Once on land, the crew would collapse the screen and the tank would fight normally. The concept was ingenious, but the DD tanks had limitations. They had been designed and tested for relatively calm water. In rough seas, waves could swamp the canvas screen, flooding the tank and dragging it to the bottom. The 71st Tank Battalion would launch 32 DD tanks in front of the eastern sectors of Omaha. The 743rd Tank Battalion would launch 32 DD tanks supporting the western sectors. These 64 tanks, arriving 5 minutes before the infantry, were supposed to provide crucial covering fire as the soldiers crossed the beach. Finally, the naval component of the assault force included not just the bombardment ships, but also a fleet of landing craft of various types. LCTs carried the tanks. LCIs brought additional infantry. DUKWs, amphibious trucks called ducks, would ferry supplies from ships to shore. Smaller craft would serve as control vessels, guiding the waves of landing craft to their proper sectors. Altogether, more than 1,000 vessels would be involved in the assault on Omaha Beach alone. The men who would execute this plan came from every corner of America. Farm boys from the Midwest, factory workers from industrial cities, college students who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, immigrants seeking to prove their loyalty to their adopted homeland. Some were as young as 18, fresh from training camps. Others were in their 30s, family men with wives and children back home. They spoke different dialects, came from different backgrounds, had different levels of education and experience. But on June 6, 1944, they would all be soldiers, united in purpose, facing the same deadly beach. In the final hours before H hour, as landing craft assembled in the transport area and began their run toward shore, these men made their final preparations. Some prayed, repeating familiar words from childhood churches. Others joked nervously, trying to maintain morale through humor. A few wrote last letters just in case, tucking them into waterproof pouches. Many simply sat in silence, lost in thought, trying to comprehend what they were about to experience. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, the unit that would land on Dog Green directly in front of the heaviest German defenses, was composed largely of men from the small town of Bedford, Virginia. In a town of about 3,000 people, Company A drew 34 soldiers from Bedford and the surrounding county. These men had grown up together, gone to school together, worked together. Now they would fight together. And within minutes of landing, 19 of those Bedford boys would be dead, giving that small Virginia town the highest per capita D-Day loss of any community in America. They did not know this as they approached the beach. They knew only that they had trained for this moment, that their country and the world depended on them, that failure was not an option. They steeled themselves for what was coming, each man dealing with fear in his own way, each man hoping he would have the courage to do his duty when the ramp dropped and German bullets began to fly. The bombardment failures. At 5:50 a.m. on June 6th, the pre-dawn darkness over Omaha Beach was shattered by the opening salvos of the naval bombardment. From offshore, battleships USS Texas and USS Arkansas unleashed their main batteries. The Texas fired 14-inch shells, each weighing 1,500 pounds, while the Arkansas added its 12-inch guns to the barrage. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous rolling thunder that could be felt in the chest from miles away. Cruisers joined in, their smaller but more rapid-firing guns adding to the symphony of destruction. Destroyers, positioned closer to shore, contributed their 5-inch guns to the bombardment. For the men in the landing craft, watching from several miles offshore, the sight was awe-inspiring. Great blooms of flame erupted from the gun barrels. Seconds later, massive explosions lit up the French coastline. Smoke and dust billowed into the air. Some soldiers cheered. Surely, they thought, nothing could survive such firepower. The German defenders must be dead or running. The landing would be a walkover. They were catastrophically wrong. The naval bombardment at Omaha Beach was inadequate from the start, hampered by constraints that reflected conflicting priorities and incomplete understanding of what would be required. Unlike in the Pacific Theater, where American amphibious assaults had evolved to include prolonged, intensive naval gunfire support lasting hours or even days, the bombardment at Normandy was brief and limited. At Omaha Beach, the big guns fired for only 40 minutes before H hour. This timing was driven by the desire to maintain surprise and the fear that a longer bombardment would give the Germans time to reinforce the beach area. Kenneth P. Lord, a U.S. Army planner who helped design the D-Day invasion, later expressed serious concerns about the naval gunfire support plan. When he learned that Omaha Beach would be supported by only one battleship, 2 cruisers, and 6 destroyers, he and other planners were dismayed. They pointed to the massive naval support provided for Pacific operations, where multiple battleships and cruisers would pummel landing zones for hours. But the Normandy planners focused on achieving surprise and managing the enormous logistical complexity of a multi-beach assault could not provide more. The result was predictable. Naval gunfire, while impressive to watch, was not particularly effective against hardened concrete fortifications unless shells scored direct hits. The German bunkers and casemates had been constructed with walls several feet thick, designed specifically to withstand bombardment. Most naval shells that struck near these positions simply cratered the earth around them without penetrating the concrete. The Germans inside were shaken, deafened by concussion, sometimes knocked unconscious by the force of near misses, but they survived. And when the bombardment lifted, they emerged from their bunkers, manned their weapons, and prepared to fight. The heavier German guns, particularly those in casemates with embrasures facing seaward, did take some damage. A few positions were knocked out by lucky hits that penetrated through the firing slits. But these were exceptions. Most of the fortified positions remained operational when the naval bombardment ended at 6:30 a.m. If the naval bombardment was inadequate, the aerial bombardment was a complete failure. In the hours before dawn on June 6th, 448 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force took off from bases in England. Their target, the German defenses at Omaha Beach. They carried approximately 13,000 bombs, 500-pounders for the most part, more than enough explosive power to devastate the beach fortifications if properly delivered. But the mission was flawed from the start. The B-17 was a strategic bomber designed for high-altitude area bombing of cities and industrial targets. Using these aircraft for close tactical support of ground troops in a combat landing was problematic. The bombardiers would have to make precise drops from high altitude in darkness or twilight, with clouds obscuring the target, and with the knowledge that American soldiers were about to land in the very area they were bombing. Any mistake, any bomb falling short, would kill friendly troops. To prevent such fratricide, bomber crews received strict orders: do not drop early. If you cannot see your target clearly, if there is any doubt about your position, delay your release. Better to miss the target entirely than to hit the landing craft approaching the beach. This order, well-intentioned and necessary, became a disaster. On the morning of June 6th, as the bombers approached Omaha Beach, they found the coast obscured by clouds and darkness. Bombardiers peering through their sights could not see the beach clearly. Worried about dropping short, they delayed their releases by seconds. At bombing altitude and speed, those seconds translated to bombs falling hundreds of yards inland, behind the German defenses. The result was that virtually all 13,000 bombs missed their targets. They exploded in fields and orchards behind Omaha Beach, killing cows and cratering farmland, but leaving the beach defenses untouched. When the bomber crews returned to England and filed their reports, they believed they had done their job. The bombs had fallen. The mission was complete. But reconnaissance photographs taken later in the day would reveal the truth. The German fortifications were intact. This failure had multiple causes. The B-17s were the wrong tool for the job. They should have been replaced by medium bombers like the B-25 or A-20, aircraft designed for tactical bombing at lower altitudes with better visibility and accuracy. But the heavy bomber advocates in the Army Air Forces insisted that their aircraft could do the job, and they were given the mission. The timing was also problematic. Pre-dawn bombing in cloudy conditions over a blacked-out coastline was asking for trouble. And the orders to avoid fratricide, while necessary, all but guaranteed that bombs would fall long if there was any doubt about the aim point. Some historians have argued that even perfect execution of the aerial bombardment would not have destroyed the German defenses. Concrete bunkers were extraordinarily tough. To reliably destroy them required either very heavy bombs, precision-guided munitions that did not exist in 1944, or massive bombardment that saturated the area with hundreds of direct and near hits. But the fact remains that the 13,000 bombs dropped on Omaha Beach did virtually no damage to the defenses, leaving the infantry to face fortifications that should have been neutralized or at least suppressed. Adding to the bombardment failures, the rocket-firing landing craft assigned to provide close-in fire support also proved ineffective. These LCTRs, landing craft modified to carry rocket launchers, were supposed to approach within 300 yards of shore and launch barrages of rockets at the beach defenses. The idea was sound: saturate the beach with explosive projectiles just before the infantry landed. But the execution was poor. Many rockets fell short, splashing into the surf, far from their intended targets. Those that did reach the beach lacked the punch to damage concrete fortifications. The psychological effect on German defenders was minimal, and launching the rockets created huge clouds of smoke that actually helped conceal the landing craft from German observers, a small silver lining to an otherwise failed tactic. By 6:30 a.m., when the first wave of landing craft was minutes from shore, the German defenses at Omaha Beach remained almost entirely intact. The bunkers were operational, the machine guns were manned and ready, the artillery was loaded and aimed. The German soldiers, having endured 40 minutes of naval bombardment, were shaken but fully capable of fighting. They watched through binoculars and gun sights as the American landing craft formed up and began their final approach. Some German officers recognized immediately that the bombardment had failed. The Americans would be coming ashore against an undiminished defense. It would be a slaughter. In the planning rooms and command ships offshore, American commanders did not yet understand the magnitude of the bombardment failure. Reports from aircraft and ships suggested that the beach had been hit hard. Smoke and dust from explosions obscured the area, creating the impression of devastating damage. It would not be until the first wave landed, until the first soldiers stepped off their landing craft into a hail of machine gun fire, that the terrible truth would become clear. The bombardment had accomplished almost nothing. The Germans were still there, still fighting, still very much capable of defending their positions. And the Americans, laden with heavy equipment, Exhausted from a rough night crossing the channel, many seasick from the boat ride, were about to wade into one of the most intense killing zones in military history. H-hour, -30. The approach and drowning tanks. At approximately 5:35 a.m., about 6,000 yards offshore from Omaha Beach, the landing craft carrying the DD tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion reached their launch position. The sea was rough, with waves running 4 to 6 feet, far worse than the 1-foot swells the DD tanks had been designed to handle. The LCT ramps dropped, and the first tanks, engines running, propellers engaged, screen raised, began to drive off into the channel. Within minutes, disaster unfolded. The first tank to launch immediately began taking on water. Waves crashed over the low-sitting canvas screen. Water poured in faster than the bilge pumps could handle. The tank's engine sputtered and died. The crew, realizing their vehicle was sinking, tried to escape through the hatches, but the collapsing wet canvas and the weight of water made this difficult. Some men managed to inflate their life rafts and scramble clear. Others went down with their tank. The second tank launched from the same LCT. It suffered an identical fate, swamped and sinking within 100 yards of the launching point. The third tank's crew saw what was happening and still chose to launch, driven by training and duty. It too sank. The fourth tank, its screen already damaged by debris from an explosion, sank almost immediately after driving off the ramp, taking all 5 crewmen to the bottom in 88 feet of water. Sergeant John Surtell, commanding that fourth tank, never had a chance. His body was recovered later that day by another landing craft. Across the launch area, this scene repeated with horrifying consistency. Company C of the 741st Tank Battalion launched 16 DD tanks. All 16 sank, every single one. The crews, equipped with emergency breathing apparatus that could function for 5 minutes underwater, struggled to escape their drowning vehicles. Most succeeded, though 5 men died in the sinkings. The survivors floated in the cold water, watching their tanks disappear beneath the waves, waiting to be picked up by rescue craft. Company B of the 741st fared slightly better, but only because some LCT crews recognized the disaster unfolding and made courageous decisions to ignore orders. Ensign Henry Sullivan, commanding LCT 600, watched the first DD tank from his craft sink within yards of launch. He immediately countermanded the order to launch the remaining 3 tanks aboard his vessel. Instead, he took them all the way to the beach, delivering them directly onto the sand. Other LCT commanders made similar choices. But by then, 13 of Company B's 16 tanks had already launched, and most of them sank. Only 2 DD tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion successfully swam to shore under their own power. 2 tanks out of 29 launched. The decision to launch the DD tanks so far from shore, in such rough conditions, would be debated for decades. The tanks had been tested in various conditions during training, but never in seas this rough. The warning signs were there. Other amphibious vehicles, particularly the WWII amphibious trucks, were swamping in the offshore assembly area. Infantry landing craft were taking on water, forcing crews to bail constantly. Yet the order to launch the DD tanks went out, and most company commanders complied. Captain James Thornton of the 741st Tank Battalion and Captain Ned Elder of the 743rd Tank Battalion had discretion to make the final call on launching their DD tanks. Thornton, after consulting with his battalion commander and observing the sea conditions, decided to launch. The results were catastrophic for his unit. Elder, facing identical conditions on the western half of the beach, made the opposite decision. He ordered his LCTs to take the DD tanks all the way to shore, landing them directly on the beach under fire if necessary. This decision, made in defiance of the original plan, saved the 743rd's tanks. While they would take casualties from German fire, they at least made it to shore and were able to fight. The loss of the 741st's DD tanks meant that the entire eastern half of Omaha Beach, where the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division would land, would be without immediate armored support. The infantry would hit the beach with only 5 DD tanks that had managed to swim ashore, plus a few regular Sherman tanks and bulldozers that would be delivered later. This was a fraction of the planned tank support. The consequences would be severe. While the tank disaster played out offshore, the infantry in their landing craft continued toward the beach. The assault companies had loaded into their LCVPs from the larger transport ships at about 5 a.m. The transfer was difficult in the rough seas. Soldiers climbed down cargo nets slung over the sides of the transports, timing their jumps to land in the rising and falling landing craft below. Some men fell into the gap between ship and boat. A few were crushed when the boats slammed against the hull. Most made it safely aboard, but they were already soaked with spray and exhausted from the effort. The Higgins boats circled in the assembly area, forming into waves according to the plan. Each wave had an assigned sector, a specific time to hit the beach, a specific mission. The first wave, Companies A and E of the 116th Regiment and Companies E and F of the 16th Regiment, would land at H-hour 6:30 a.m. They were the assault companies tasked with the most dangerous job, crossing the beach under fire and attacking the German strongpoints. Behind them, at 5-minute and 10-minute intervals, would come the following waves, bringing more infantry, engineers, medical personnel, and headquarters staff. As the landing craft began their final run to shore, the men inside could see very little over the high sides of the Higgins boats. Most soldiers crouched or sat on the deck, trying to stay low, trying to avoid the spray that constantly washed over the sides. The boats bucked and rolled in the surf. Many men were seasick, and the stench was overwhelming. Diesel fuel mixed with vomit, sweat, and the metallic smell of fear that veterans would later say has no equivalent in civilian life. Some soldiers tried to peer over the sides to see where they were going. They could make out the coastline now, cliffs and bluffs rising behind the beach, smoke and dust from the naval bombardment drifting across the landscape. Veteran accounts from later years describe conflicting emotions in those final minutes. Some felt a surge of confidence watching the Navy blast the German positions. Others, particularly those of the 1st Division, who had landed under fire in North Africa and Sicily, sensed that something was wrong. The beach looked too intact. The German fortifications seemed undamaged. These experienced soldiers knew that things rarely went according to plan, that the first moments on the beach would be chaos, that people were going to die. They hoped they would not be among them, but they understood the odds. As the landing craft approached within a few hundred yards of shore, the naval bombardment lifted. The sudden silence was eerie. For 40 minutes, the roar of naval guns had been constant. Now it stopped. The coxswains throttled up their engines, aiming for the beach at full speed. Some landing craft were on target, heading for their assigned sectors. Others, driven off course by wind and current, were approaching the wrong beaches. Company A of the 116th Regiment, supposed to land on Dog Green, found most of its boats drifting eastward toward the Dog White and Dog Red sectors. This meant they would land in front of unfamiliar terrain, away from their planned objectives, intermixed with other units. The careful organization of the assault was already breaking down. Aboard the landing craft, soldiers made their final preparations. They checked their weapons one more time. They helped each other adjust their loads. Some men prayed aloud, voices barely audible over the engine noise. Others simply stared at the ramp, knowing that in minutes it would drop, and they would have to run out into whatever awaited them. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft were seconds from shore. The men inside could hear a new sound now, above the engines and the waves, a rapid popping and cracking that grew louder as they approached. It took a moment for them to realize what they were hearing. Machine gun fire, German machine guns opening up on the landing craft, and then they felt the impacts. Bullets striking the hull, punching through the thin metal in places, ricocheting inside the boat. Men began to fall, hit before the ramp even dropped. The coxswains hunched behind their small armored shields, trying to steer through the hail of fire while keeping their boats moving forward. And then, all along Omaha Beach, the ramps began to drop with metallic crashes that would echo in survivors' nightmares for decades. H-hour had arrived. The first wave was going in. 6:30 a.m., H-hour. The first wave hits the beach. Company A. A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, the unit from Bedford, Virginia, approached Dog Green sector at exactly 6:30 a.m. Their 6 landing craft were strung out in a rough line, each boat carrying 30 to 35 men. As the boats came within 200 yards of shore, German machine gunners in the Vierville strongpoint WN-72 opened fire. Tracers arced across the water. Bullets hammered against the steel sides of the landing craft. The first boat to hit the sand was carrying the company headquarters section. According to survivor testimony collected after the war, Captain Taylor Fellers stepped forward to lead his men off when the ramp dropped. A burst of machine gun fire cut him down before he took 2 steps. He fell into the surf, dying almost instantly. The men behind him tried to follow, but the German fire was so intense that forward movement seemed impossible. Witness accounts describe some soldiers frozen at the ramp, while others jumped over the sides into deeper water, hoping to find some protection below the surface. Private Robert Sales, interviewed decades later about his experience in the 5th landing craft to hit Dog Green, described the scene in vivid detail. The ramp dropped, and immediately men started falling. He saw his squad leader shot in the head. He saw men hit before they could move. The water in front of the boat turned red with blood. Sails jumped over the side into chest-deep water and waded toward shore as bullets splashed all around him. He saw men beside him go down, hit by machine gun fire or mortar fragments. He kept moving, focused only on reaching some kind of cover. But there was no cover on Dog Green. The beach was open, flat sand with the seawall 300 yards ahead. Between the water and the seawall was nothing but emptiness and death. German machine guns at WN-72 had perfect fields of fire along this sector. The bunkers and pillboxes were positioned to create crossing fire, meaning every square foot of beach could be swept by bullets from multiple positions. And the Germans were firing methodically, traversing their guns back and forth across the beach, mowing down the Americans as they struggled through the surf. Within 10 minutes, Company A had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Of the 230 men who landed, 96 were killed or wounded in the first wave. The survivors huddled behind beach obstacles, behind the few knocked out German fortifications on the waterline, behind the bodies of their dead comrades. They could not move forward. They could not retreat. They could only try to stay alive as bullets and mortar rounds continued to fall among them. The neighboring sector, WWII, fared little better. Company G of the 115th Infantry Regiment landed there at 6:36 a.m., 6 minutes late, due to strong currents that had pushed their boats eastward. As their landing craft approached the beach, a mortar round struck one boat, killing several men and wounding others. The rest made it to shore, but they immediately came under intense fire from WN-68, a strong point above the beach. Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, commanding the 5th Ranger Battalion, landed on WWII as part of the Ranger Force that had been diverted to Omaha when no success signal came from Pointe du Hoc. His men hit the beach under heavy fire. Schneider saw soldiers falling everywhere. He saw landing craft taking direct hits from German artillery, exploding in flames. He realized immediately that the plan had failed, that the bombardment had not suppressed the German defenses, that his Rangers were landing into a catastrophe. On the eastern half of Omaha Beach, Companies E and F of the 16th Infantry Regiment were landing on Easy Red and Fox Green sectors. They faced similar devastation. Company E hit Easy Red at 6:30 a.m. exactly. Their landing craft approached through rough surf. Several boats grounded on sandbars 50 to 100 yards from shore, forcing men to wade through deeper water than expected. As the ramps dropped, German machine gunners at WN-62 and WN-64 opened fire. Sergeant John Robert Slaughter of Company D landing behind Company E later described watching the first wave go in. He saw men falling as soon as the ramps dropped. He saw the water churning with bullets. He saw soldiers trying to hide behind beach obstacles, only to be picked off by German snipers. He saw wounded men dragged down by their heavy equipment, drowning in 3 feet of water because they lacked the strength to keep their heads up. Company F landed on Fox Green, the whole easternmost sector of Omaha Beach. They approached in good order, their landing craft relatively close to their assigned positions. But as they came within range of the German positions, particularly WN-60 on the high cliffs at the eastern end of the beach, the concentrated fire was devastating. One landing craft took a direct hit from an artillery shell, disintegrating in a ball of flame. Another boat struck a mine on one of the beach obstacles, blowing a hole in its hull. The boat began to sink, and men had to swim or drown. Lieutenant John Spaulding, commanding a platoon of Company E, landed on Easy Red among the first wave. His boat grounded on a sandbar. As the ramp dropped, Spaulding saw the carnage ahead, soldiers lying in the surf, some dead, some wounded and calling for help, some just trying to crawl forward. He ordered his men off the boat. They jumped into chest-deep water and began wading toward shore. German fire was intense. Spaulding saw his radio man hit and killed. He saw another man beside him go down. He kept moving, shouting encouragement to his soldiers, trying to keep them together as they struggled through the surf. The DD tanks that had managed to reach shore were trying to engage the German positions, but with limited success. The tanks were firing their 75mm main guns at bunkers and pillboxes, but from positions low on the beach, often half submerged in the surf, their fire was not effective. They could not get clear aim points on the German strong points above them. And the Germans, spotting the tanks, began engaging them with anti-tank guns. One by one, the tanks that had survived the swim to shore were knocked out or disabled. The engineer special brigades, tasked with clearing beach obstacles within the first 30 minutes, landed into this maelstrom. The engineers were supposed to blow gaps through the Belgian gates, hedgehogs, and mined stakes that lined the beach. Each gap was to be 50 yards wide, marked with colored flags to guide subsequent landing craft. 16 gaps were planned, 8 on each half of Omaha Beach. But the engineers found themselves under fire the moment their landing craft grounded. Many were hit before they could unload their explosives. Those who made it to shore discovered that infantry soldiers, desperately seeking cover, were hiding behind the very obstacles the engineers needed to destroy. Sergeant Barton Davis of an engineer team landing on Easy Red saw the impossible situation immediately. He and his men had to place explosives on steel obstacles under heavy machine gun fire, while trying not to kill American soldiers taking cover behind those same obstacles. He shouted at the infantry to move, to get away from the obstacles. Some did. Others, paralyzed by fear or wounded, could not move. Davis and his team began their work anyway, placing charges, stringing detonation cord, trying to create a gap. A burst of machine gun fire cut down 2 of his engineers. German mortars began falling on the beach, adding to the chaos. Davis continued placing charges, knowing that if he did not clear this gap, the landing craft behind him would have no safe path to shore. He was working on the final charge when a mortar round exploded nearby, wounding him with fragments in the leg and shoulder. He finished the connection, yelled a warning, and detonated the charges. The explosion was tremendous, throwing steel debris in all directions. When the smoke cleared, a gap had been opened, but Davis's team had taken 50% casualties. And this was just one gap out of the 16 planned. Across Omaha Beach, this pattern repeated. Engineers died trying to clear obstacles. Infantry died trying to cross the beach. Tanks were knocked out, trying to provide support. The carefully orchestrated plan disintegrated into a desperate struggle for survival. Men who had trained for months found their training useless in the face of this overwhelming German fire. Sergeants and lieutenants, the junior leaders who were supposed to rally their units and lead them forward, were among the first casualties. Without leadership, squads and platoons fragmented into small groups of individuals, each man making his own decisions about where to move, where to find cover, whether to advance or simply survive. The German defenders, meanwhile, were fighting exactly as they had been trained. Machine gunners fired in short, controlled bursts to conserve ammunition and maintain their rate of fire. Mortar crews dropped rounds onto pre-registered coordinates locations where they knew Americans would be concentrated. Artillery observers called in fire missions on clusters of landing craft approaching the shore. The German soldiers did not need to aim carefully. The beach was so crowded with targets that every burst, every shell, found American flesh. Private Heinrich Severloh at WN62 later provided one of the most detailed German accounts of the battle. In interviews conducted decades after the war, Severloh estimated that he fired more than 12,000 rounds from his MG-42 machine gun during the course of June 6th, much of it in the first hour. He described the experience as mechanical, almost impersonal, loading belt after belt, aiming at groups of soldiers below his position, firing, watching men fall, traversing to the next group, firing again. In his memoir, Severloh expressed no joy in the killing, but rather described himself as simply doing his duty as he understood it, defending his position and fighting for his comrades. By 7 a.m., just 30 minutes after H hour, Omaha Beach had become what one American officer called a killing zone. The beach was littered with bodies, American dead and wounded lying in the surf, on the sand against the seawall. Equipment was scattered everywhere: rifles, helmets, packs, radios, all abandoned by soldiers hit before they could reach cover. Burning vehicles marked where landing craft or tanks had been struck by German artillery. The water near shore was red with blood. And still, the landing craft kept coming wave after wave, disgorging more men into this hell. 6:45 700, chaos, and the seawall. By 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes into the assault, the beach at Omaha had become a scene of unprecedented chaos. The carefully planned waves of assault troops were intermixed and disorganized. Landing craft, driven off course by currents and smoke, were depositing men in the wrong sectors. Units that were supposed to land together were scattered across hundreds of yards. Officers could not find their men. Men could not find their officers. Radio communications, critical to coordinating the assault, had largely broken down. Many radio sets had been damaged by water or enemy fire. Radio operators were among the first casualties, targeted by German snipers who recognized the antenna whips, marking command positions. The seawall, a concrete and stone barrier 3 to 10 feet high running along much of the length of Omaha Beach, became a magnet for soldiers desperately seeking shelter. Men crawled, ran, stumbled across the beach toward this barrier, the only solid cover available between the water and the bluffs. Behind the seawall, soldiers huddled in groups, trying to catch their breath, trying to comprehend what had happened, trying to decide what to do next. But the seawall was a trap, as much as a refuge. German machine gunners and mortar crews had the area behind the wall pre-registered. They knew exactly where Americans would seek cover, and they poured fire into those areas. Soldiers behind the wall were not safe. They were merely temporarily sheltered. To move over the wall, to advance toward the bluffs, meant exposing themselves to direct fire from the German positions above. But to stay behind the wall meant being pinned down, unable to accomplish any mission, vulnerable to mortars and artillery. Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, landed on Dog White at approximately 7:20 a.m., nearly an hour late due to delays in his landing craft. Cota, a 51-year-old veteran officer, immediately grasped the desperate situation. He moved along the seawall, talking to soldiers, urging them to get moving, to get off the beach. He found clusters of Rangers from the 5th Battalion pinned down and disorganized. According to multiple witness accounts, though the exact wording remains disputed by historians, Cota approached the Rangers with words that would become part of D-Day legend. Something to the effect of, "Rangers lead the way." Whether these were his precise words or a close paraphrase remembered by veterans, his message was unmistakably clear. Elite soldiers were needed to break the stalemate, to show the rest of the troops that the German positions could be attacked. Cota personally led groups of soldiers in assaulting the bluffs. He found a gap in the wire obstacles that lined the top of the seawall. He led Rangers and infantrymen through the gap and up the slopes beyond, demonstrating that movement was possible, that the German defenses could be penetrated. His courage under fire, his willingness to expose himself to danger to inspire his men, would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross and become a symbol of the leadership that gradually turned the tide at Omaha Beach. But individual acts of courage, as important as they were, could not immediately solve the larger crisis. By 7 a.m., only a handful of the planned objectives had been achieved. No exits from the beach had been opened. No strong points had been captured. The engineer teams had managed to clear only 6 gaps through the beach obstacles, far short of the 16 planned. And even these gaps were under constant enemy fire. Follow-on waves of landing craft trying to navigate to shore found themselves grounding on obstacles, hitting mines, taking casualties before their troops could disembark. The medical situation was becoming desperate. Casualties were mounting by the minute. The first wave had suffered heavily, but the subsequent waves were also taking losses as landing craft were hit by artillery fire or grounded on obstacles. Wounded men lay everywhere, on the beach, in the surf, behind the seawall. Combat medics, distinguished by their Red Cross armbands, moved among the casualties, trying to provide aid under fire. The medics faced impossible choices. They had limited supplies: morphine for pain, bandages for bleeding, plasma for shock. They could not evacuate the seriously wounded because there was no safe way to get them back to the landing craft. German snipers were targeting medics, despite the protections theoretically afforded by the Geneva Conventions. Many medics were killed or wounded while treating patients. Those who survived had to decide which casualties to treat first, knowing that they could not save everyone, that some men would die while waiting for care. One particular horror of Omaha Beach was the fate of men wounded in the water. Soldiers hit while waiting ashore often fell face down into the surf. The weight of their equipment, 60 or 70 pounds of gear, made it difficult or impossible for wounded men to keep their heads above water. Some drowned in as little as 2 feet of water, too injured to stand, too weak to crawl. Other soldiers tried to help, dragging wounded comrades to shore, but under intense fire, this often meant exposing themselves to additional danger. Many would-be rescuers became casualties themselves. The rising tide added another element of urgency. When the first wave landed at 6:30 a.m., the tide was relatively low, though not at its lowest point. As minutes passed, the water crept higher, advancing up the beach. Wounded men who had found cover behind beach obstacles or low points in the sand found themselves in rising water. The tide was unforgiving. Medical personnel had to move casualties to higher ground, a task nearly impossible under fire. Some wounded, Soldiers were left where they fell, and the rising water claimed them. The specialized tanks and equipment that were supposed to support the infantry assault had mostly been lost or rendered ineffective. Of the 29 DD tanks launched by the 741st Tank Battalion, only 2 had reached shore swimming under their own power, and 3 more had been delivered directly to the beach by LCTs whose crews refused to launch them. In total, 5 tanks from the 741st were operational on the eastern half of the beach, a fraction of the planned 32. The 743rd Tank Battalion, having brought its tanks directly to shore, had better luck, but even they were taking casualties. German anti-tank guns were systematically engaging and destroying American armor. The DD tanks that did make it to shore found themselves in a difficult tactical situation. Their 75mm guns were potent against infantry and light fortifications, but the German bunkers required direct hits to penetrate, and the tanks were firing from low positions on the beach with poor angles. Some tanks tried to move up the beach to gain better firing positions, but the soft sand, combined with the weight of the tanks, caused them to bog down. Others remained in the surf, half submerged, firing at targets they could barely see through the smoke and dust. By mid-morning, many of these tanks would be knocked out or abandoned. The demolition teams tasked with clearing beach obstacles suffered catastrophic casualties. The Naval Combat Demolition Units, NCDUs, working alongside Army engineers, were supposed to blow 50-yard gaps through the obstacles within 30 minutes of H-hour. But the combination of heavy fire, wounded infantry taking cover behind the very obstacles to be destroyed, and equipment losses made this nearly impossible. Some teams simply could not get to work because the fire was too intense. Others placed their charges and found that when they tried to detonate them, nothing happened, the detonation cord having been cut by shell fragments or bullets. A few teams successfully cleared their assigned gaps, but at horrific cost. The overall casualty rate among the engineers and demolition teams exceeded 40% in the first hour. Entire teams were wiped out, leaving their missions unaccomplished. By 7 a.m., the situation at Omaha Beach was so dire that some commanders began considering evacuation. Rear Admiral John Hall, commanding the Naval Task Force offshore, received reports of the disaster unfolding on the beach. His staff suggested that perhaps the landing should be called off, that follow-on waves should be diverted to other beaches where the landings were going better. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army from the cruiser USS Augusta offshore, seriously contemplated ordering a withdrawal from Omaha and redirecting forces to Utah Beach or the British beaches. But Bradley decided to wait to see if the situation could be salvaged. He knew that evacuating Omaha Beach would be nearly as dangerous as the landing had been. Extracting thousands of men under fire, abandoning equipment and supplies, would create chaos and heavy casualties. More importantly, losing Omaha would create a gap of more than 20 miles between Utah Beach and the British beaches, making the entire lodgment vulnerable. The Allies needed Omaha. There was no acceptable alternative. The assault would continue no matter the cost. On the beach itself, soldiers were beginning to understand that survival depended on moving forward. Staying on the beach meant death or capture. The German fire would not slacken. More landing craft were arriving every few minutes, depositing more men and equipment into the killing zone. The beach was becoming congested, crowded with vehicles, supplies, and soldiers, all presenting increasingly dense targets for German artillery. The only way out was up, over the seawall, across the minefields, up the bluffs, into the German positions. Small groups of soldiers, often just a squad or two, began to move. They did not move because of orders. Most had not seen an officer or received instructions in 30 minutes. They moved because staying meant dying slowly. They moved because a few brave souls stood up and started walking toward the bluffs, and others followed. They moved because soldiers are trained to attack, and despite the terror and chaos, that training reasserted itself. 7:7:15. The crisis deepens. At 7 a.m., 30 minutes after H hour, the situation at Omaha Beach reached its lowest point. The first wave had been shattered, the second wave was pinned down, and the third wave was approaching a beach that offered no safe landing zone. The carefully choreographed assault plan had completely disintegrated. What was supposed to have been a coordinated attack by regiment strength forces had devolved into dozens of isolated struggles by small groups of soldiers fighting for survival. The congestion on the beach was becoming critical. Landing craft continued to arrive, guided by control vessels offshore that were following the original schedule. These craft grounded wherever they could find space, often far from their assigned sectors. Some hit obstacles and disabled mines, exploding before men could disembark. Others successfully landed their troops, only to see those soldiers run into the same machine gun fire that had decimated the earlier waves. The beach was now crowded with men, equipment, disabled vehicles, and casualties, creating increasingly dense target arrays for German artillery observers. At 7:10 a.m., the assault by Company F of the 16th Infantry Regiment on Fox Green Sector culminated in disaster. This company had landed in the first wave, taking heavy casualties immediately. The survivors had worked their way across the beach to the seawall, where they attempted to reorganize. Lieutenant John Spaulding, one of the few officers still unwounded, rallied about 30 men and led them in an attempt to breach the German wire and advance toward the bluffs. As his group moved over the seawall, German machine guns from WN-60 opened fire at close range. Men fell in clusters. Spaulding was wounded but continued forward. His platoon sergeant, Philip Strechik, was killed. The attack faltered, and survivors fell back to the seawall, having gained nothing but more casualties. Similar small unit attacks were being attempted all along Omaha Beach. Groups of 10, 20, sometimes 50 soldiers would try to move forward. Most were stopped by machine gun fire before they could advance more than a few dozen yards. The German defenders had excellent observation from their positions on the bluffs. They could see movement on the beach and respond instantly with concentrated fire. Every attempt to advance seemed to result in more American dead and wounded. The artillery situation heavily favored the Germans. The American artillery, mostly 105mm howitzers that were supposed to be landed in the early waves to provide fire support, was almost entirely absent. Some artillery pieces had been lost when their landing craft were sunk or hit. Others had made it to shore, but could not be moved off the beach due to the congestion and continued German fire. The few artillery pieces that were operational could not find good firing positions. and lacked forward observers to direct their fire accurately. German artillery, by contrast, was functioning efficiently. The 352nd Artillery Regiment had batteries of 105mm and 150mm howitzers positioned several miles inland beyond the range of naval gunfire. These guns had pre-plotted fire missions for various zones on Omaha Beach. When German observers called in targets, artillery rounds arrived within a minute or two, landing with deadly accuracy among concentrations of American troops and equipment. The howitzer batteries also engaged American destroyers that ventured too close to shore, forcing them to maintain a respectful distance and reducing the effectiveness of their fire support. The communication breakdown continued to hamper American efforts. Radio communications between the beach and the command ships offshore were sporadic at best. Many signals were garbled or lost entirely. The ships offshore had only a vague understanding of the disaster unfolding on the beach. They knew that casualties were heavy and that the assault had not gone according to plan, but they did not grasp the full extent of the crisis. Reports reaching General Bradley on the USS Augusta suggested that the situation was serious but not catastrophic. He did not yet know that only 5 tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion had reached shore, that none of the beach exits had been opened, that American forces had not advanced more than 100 yards inland anywhere on Omaha. At 7:15 a.m., the beachmaster on Omaha Beach, the naval officer responsible for coordinating the landing of follow-on waves, made a critical decision. He radioed offshore to Admiral Hall. Advance of follow-up waves has stopped. Beach conditions not favorable for landing. This was Navy understatement for a catastrophe. The beachmaster was essentially saying that continuing to land troops on Omaha Beach under current conditions would result in their massacre. He recommended suspending further landings until the situation improved. This recommendation created a dilemma for the offshore commanders. If they stopped sending troops to Omaha, the men already on the beach would be unsupported, their situation hopeless. If they continued landing troops, more soldiers would be fed into the killing zone, adding to the casualties without necessarily improving the tactical situation. It was a choice between bad and worse, and the decision had to be made quickly. Admiral Hall and his staff decided to continue the landings, but to adjust the landing points. Landing craft heading for the most heavily contested sectors, particularly Dog Green, where Company A had been decimated, would be redirected to other areas where German fire might be less intense. This was improvisation born of desperation, an attempt to find any way to get troops ashore with fewer casualties. But it meant abandoning some sectors entirely for the time being, conceding those beaches to German control. On Dog Green itself, the survivors of Company A were in a desperate situation. Of the 230 men who had landed there at H hour, fewer than a third were still able to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or so pinned down by fire that they could not move. Captain Fellers was dead. Most of the officers and sergeants were casualties. The company had ceased to exist as an organized unit. The men who survived were scattered along the beach, hiding behind obstacles, behind the seawall, anywhere that offered even the slightest cover. Private Robert Sales, who had jumped over the side of his landing craft and waded through the surf under fire, found himself alone. behind a knocked-out German pillbox at the waterline. He had lost contact with his squad. He did not know if his friends were alive or dead. He could hear the continuous rattle of machine gun fire, the crump of mortar rounds exploding, the screams of wounded men. He knew he had to do something, but what? To move meant almost certain death. To stay meant being slowly picked off by snipers or mortars. He chose to stay, pressing himself against the concrete, trying to become invisible. All along Omaha Beach, this scene repeated in various forms. Individual soldiers and small groups huddled in whatever cover they could find, trying to survive, hoping that someone somewhere would figure out a way to break the stalemate. The planned assault had failed. The bombardment had failed. The armor support had failed. But the soldiers remained, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the nature of the battle began to shift. 7:15, 7:30, small unit actions and breakthroughs. At 7:22 a.m., Lieutenant Spaulding and his surviving men from Company E, 16th Infantry Regiment, made another attempt to move off Easy Red Sector. This time, instead of attacking directly up the main draw toward Colville, which was heavily defended, Spaulding led his group along the seawall to the east, looking for a weak point in the German defenses. They found a gap in the wire at the base of the bluffs between two strong points. Under covering fire from a few other soldiers at the seawall, Spaulding's group scrambled through the gap and began climbing the steep slope. The climb was treacherous. The slope was covered with brush and mines. German soldiers above spotted them and began firing down. Spaulding's group took casualties, but they kept climbing, using whatever handholds they could find, pulling themselves up the nearly vertical face. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, they reached the top of the bluffs. They had penetrated the German defensive line. Spaulding's group was tiny, only about 20 men by the time they reached the top. But their success demonstrated something crucial. The German positions could be flanked. The strong points were designed to fire along the beach and out to sea. They had limited ability to engage targets that approached from the flanks or rear. If soldiers could find the gaps between strong points and climb the bluffs, they could attack the German positions from behind. Word of Spaulding's success did not spread in any organized way. There was no radio to broadcast the information. But other soldiers watching from the seawall saw what Spaulding's group had done. They began looking for their own paths up the bluffs, their own weak points in the defenses. Small groups, usually no more than a squad or platoon, began moving. Each group was independent, acting on local initiative rather than orders from above. But collectively, these small unit actions began to put pressure on the German defenders. 3 miles to the west, at Pointe du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder and the Rangers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were engaged in their own desperate battle. Rudder's force had landed at the base of the cliffs at 7:10 a.m., 40 minutes late due to navigation errors. As soon as their landing craft grounded, German defenders above began throwing grenades down the cliff face and firing machine guns at the Rangers, struggling in the surf. The Rangers immediately began launching their rocket-propelled grapnels, ropes with hooks that were supposed to catch on the cliff top and provide climbing routes. But many of the ropes were waterlogged and heavy, causing the rockets to fall short. Other ropes were cut by German defenders before Rangers could climb them. The situation looked hopeless. The The Rangers were pinned at the base of 100-foot cliffs, taking casualties, with no apparent way up. But the Rangers were not ordinary soldiers. They were elite troops, specially selected and trained for exactly this kind of mission. Private Otto, Stevens took matters into his own hands. He found a spot where the cliff face was slightly less vertical, pulled out his bayonet, and began climbing, using the bayonet to create handholds by stabbing it into the soft clay and pulling himself up. Others followed his example. Meanwhile, destroyer USS Satterlee positioned itself close to shore and began firing 5-inch shells at German positions on top of Pointe du Hoc, providing covering fire for the climbing Rangers. Within 30 minutes, most of Rudder's force had reached the top of the cliffs, having suffered only about 15 casualties during the climb. This was remarkable given the circumstances. But their mission was far from over. They had climbed the cliffs to destroy the 6 155mm guns that intelligence reports indicated were positioned at Pointe du Hoc. These guns, capable of firing on both Omaha and Utah beaches, had to be neutralized. Rudder's men spread out across the cratered landscape at the top of the cliff, searching for the guns. They found the gun emplacements, concrete casemates built to house the heavy artillery. But the casemates were empty. The guns were gone. For weeks, Allied aircraft had been bombing Pointe du Hoc, and at some point the Germans had removed the guns to protect them, leaving only telephone poles in the casemates to deceive aerial reconnaissance. This discovery was disappointing but also relieving. The guns could not fire on the beaches if they were not there. But the Rangers' mission was not complete. They pushed inland from Pointe du Hoc toward the coastal road, which was one of their objectives. About 500 yards south of the cliffs, Sergeant Leonard Lamel from Company D discovered the missing guns. They were positioned in an orchard camouflaged with netting, unguarded at that moment. The Germans had moved them inland to protect them from bombing, but had not yet had time to build protective positions. Lamel and his partner, Sergeant Jack Kuhn, moved quietly through the orchard, placing thermite grenades in the traversing and elevation mechanisms of the guns, destroying them. 2 Rangers had accomplished the primary objective of the entire Pointe du Hoc mission. But Rudder's force was now isolated on top of the cliff, cut off from any support. The Germans would spend the next 2 days launching counterattacks, trying to push the Rangers back into the sea. The Rangers would hold barely until relieved on June 8th. By then, Rudder's original force of 225 men would be reduced to fewer than 90 able to fight. The cost of taking Pointe du Hoc would be steep, but the mission would be accomplished. Back at Omaha Beach, the scattered small unit actions were beginning to have a cumulative effect. By 7:30 a.m., various groups of soldiers had penetrated the German defensive line in several places. None of these breaches was large. Most involved only a few dozen men. But they created problems for the German defenders, who now had to worry about threats from multiple directions. The carefully prepared defensive scheme, with its interlocking fields of fire and pre-registered firing points, began to break down as American soldiers got behind the strong points. Brigadier General Cota continued to move along the beach, rallying soldiers and leading attacks. He found a breach in the wire near the Vieilleville Draw and led a mixed group of rangers, engineers, and infantry through it. They climbed the bluff and attacked WN-73, one of the German strongpoints overlooking Dog White. The fighting was close and brutal, with grenades and small arms at point-blank range. The Americans prevailed, killing or capturing the German defenders and taking control of the position. This was one of the first German strongpoints to fall, and its capture opened a potential route off the beach at WWII. Naval gunfire was beginning to have more effect as the morning progressed. The early bombardment had been ineffective, but as the battle developed, destroyers and cruisers were able to engage specific targets called out by spotters on the beach. The fire control liaison teams, when they could get their radios working, directed naval guns onto German artillery positions and strongpoints. Some bunkers that had survived the pre-landing bombardment were now destroyed by direct hits from destroyer guns firing at close range. One particular instance of naval gunfire support became legendary. Lieutenant Commander Ralph Ramey, commanding the destroyer USS McCook, brought his ship to within a few hundred yards of shore, scraping the bottom in the shallow water to engage German guns in the cliffs near the Vierville Draw. McCook fired more than 15 minutes of continuous bombardment at the position, eventually undermining the cliff face and causing the gun emplacement to collapse. The German gun tumbled down the cliff, and the position was silenced. Ramey's aggressive action, risking his ship to support the troops on the beach, exemplified the U.S. Navy's determination to do whatever was necessary to make the landing succeed. By 7:30 a.m., the crisis at Omaha Beach was not over, but it had reached a turning point. The first wave had been decimated, the second and third waves had taken heavy casualties, but soldiers were now moving inland in multiple places. The German defenses were under pressure from unexpected directions. Communication among German positions was breaking down as telephone lines were cut by naval gunfire and infiltrating American troops. The 352nd Division's commander, General Lieutenant Kreis, was receiving increasingly desperate calls from strongpoints requesting reinforcements, ammunition, permission to withdraw. He had no reinforcements to send. His reserve regiment, the 915th, had been diverted chasing false reports of paratroopers inland. The units on the beach were on their own. The American soldiers did not know any of this. They knew only that they were in a fight for their lives, that the plan had failed, that survival depended on their own initiative and courage. And slowly, in small groups, acting without orders or central direction, they were beginning to win. 7:30, 8 o'clock, the turn of the tide. At 7:35 a.m., the situation on Omaha Beach began to shift decisively. The scattered, independent actions by small units started to coalesce into a more general advance. In multiple sectors simultaneously, American soldiers were moving up the bluffs, attacking German positions from the flanks and rear, opening pathways for follow-on forces. The German defensive line, so strong when engaged frontally from the beach, proved vulnerable to attack from unexpected directions. On Easy Red Sector, multiple groups had now reached the top of the bluffs between WN-62 and WN-64. These soldiers from various companies and units began working their way laterally along the ridgeline, attacking the strong points from behind. The German defenders, facing the beach and engaged with targets in front of them, were surprised by Americans appearing from their flanks. Some positions were overrun quickly. Others fought back desperately, but they were defending positions designed to repel attacks from the sea, not from inland. The breakthrough at Vieilleville Draw, where General Cotta and his ad hoc force had penetrated the German line, was being exploited. More troops followed Cotta through the breach. Engineers moved up with explosives to clear the remaining obstacles blocking the draw. This was the paved road exit from the beach, the most important of the 5 draws, because it could accommodate heavy vehicles and tanks. If this draw could be fully opened, armor and supplies could move inland rapidly, providing the weight necessary to expand the beachhead. The naval fire support, which had been ineffective early in the battle, was now proving decisive. At approximately 7:40 a.m., Rear Admiral Carleton Bryant, commanding the bombardment ships off Omaha Beach, sent a message to all destroyers. "Get on them, men, get on them! They are raising hell with the men on the beach, and we can't have any more of that. We must stop it." This was not standard naval procedure, but the situation called for aggressive action. The destroyers responded with enthusiasm. USS Carmick, USS McCook, USS Doyle, USS Harding, USS Thompson, and others steamed to within hundreds of yards of shore, often in water so shallow that their keels scraped the bottom. From these close-in positions, they engaged German positions with direct fire, their 5-inch guns hitting targets that had been invisible from greater distances. The destroyers became floating artillery batteries, providing the fire support that the Army's artillery could not yet deliver. The destroyer commanders took extraordinary risks. USS Doyle, under Commander James Marshall, moved among the landing craft swarming offshore, firing continuously at German positions on the bluffs. Doyle took a direct hit from German artillery, but continued fighting, her crew manning their guns despite the damage. USS Carmick and USS McCook worked in tandem, bracketing German strongpoints with converging fire. The concentrated naval gunfire began to suppress the German positions that had inflicted such terrible casualties earlier in the morning. German ammunition was also becoming a critical problem. The machine gunners and riflemen in the strong points had been firing almost continuously for over an hour. Their ammunition stocks, which had seemed ample at the start of the battle, were running low. Some positions were down to their last few belts of machine gun ammunition. Artillery batteries inland had expended much of their pre-positioned ammunition and were having difficulty getting resupply forward under Allied air attacks. The German defenders were not defeated, but they were weakening. At 7:45 a.m., engineers on Easy Red Sector finally succeeded in fully clearing one of the beach exit draws. They had blown obstacles, cleared mines, and marked the route with tape and signs. Vehicles could now move off the beach at this point. The first tanks to use the exit were from the 743rd Tank Battalion, which had brought its DD tanks directly to shore rather than launching them at sea. These tanks, having survived the initial German fire and spent the morning engaging targets from the waterline, now moved inland to support the infantry attacking the German positions. The psychological effect of American tanks appearing on top of the bluffs was significant. German infantry, equipped only with rifles, machine guns, and a few anti-tank weapons, were not well prepared to fight armor at close range on broken ground. Some German soldiers, seeing tanks flanking their positions, chose to surrender rather than continue fighting. Others fell back to secondary positions further inland, abandoning the coastal strongpoints. The German defensive line was crumbling. By 8 a.m., 2 hours after H hour, American forces had established several small but growing footholds on the high ground above Omaha Beach. These were not large beachheads. In most cases, they extended only a few hundred yards inland and involved only a few hundred soldiers, but they were growing. More men were reaching the top of the bluffs every minute. Naval gunfire was systematically reducing the German strong points. The immediate crisis had passed. On the beach itself, the situation remained grim. The sand was littered with dead and wounded. Destroyed vehicles burned, sending thick black smoke into the sky. Landing craft continued to arrive, though at a slower pace, disembarking troops and supplies into an area that was still under sporadic German fire. Medics worked frantically to treat the wounded, setting up aid stations behind the seawall where they could provide shelter from the wind and some protection from stray bullets. The medical personnel were overwhelmed by the number of casualties. They did what they could, stabilizing the most seriously wounded for evacuation, administering morphine for pain, applying bandages to stop bleeding. The evacuation of wounded from the beach was beginning to function, though not smoothly. Landing craft that had dropped off troops and supplies would take wounded soldiers back to the transport ships offshore, where medical teams could provide more comprehensive treatment. But this process was slow and dangerous. The landing craft had to navigate through obstacles, avoid German artillery fire, and deal with the rough seas that still made boat operations difficult. Many wounded soldiers would wait hours on the beach before evacuation became possible. The cost of taking Omaha Beach in the first hour was staggering. Casualty figures are difficult to establish with precision, as records were lost, and some men listed as missing were later found alive, or their bodies recovered days later. But approximately 2,400 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. Most of these casualties occurred in the first 3 hours of the assault, with the first hour being by far the worst. Companies that landed in the first wave suffered casualty rates of 30 to 50%. Some units, like Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment on Dog Green, were effectively destroyed, losing more than 60% of their strength in the first 10 minutes. The German casualties on June 6th are less well documented. The 32nd Infantry Division lost approximately 1,200 men killed, wounded, and missing, about 20% of the division's strength. Many of these casualties occurred on Omaha Beach or in the immediate vicinity. The soldiers who had defended the strong points overlooking the beach suffered particularly heavy losses. Some positions were overrun by attacking American infantry. The defenders killed or captured. Others were destroyed by naval gunfire, burying the German soldiers inside. Still, others were abandoned when ammunition ran out or when the tactical situation became hopeless. By 8 a.m., the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a desperate defensive struggle by American forces pinned on the beach had transformed into an offensive operation. American infantry was attacking inland, supported by tanks and naval gunfire. German defenders were falling back or surrendering. The immediate outcome was no longer in doubt. The Americans would take Omaha Beach. The question now was how quickly they could expand the beachhead, how soon they could link up with forces from Utah Beach and the British beaches. how effectively they could exploit their hard-won foothold. General Bradley, receiving reports aboard the USS Augusta, began to understand that the crisis had passed. The initial reports had been so pessimistic that he had seriously considered evacuating Omaha. Now, just 90 minutes later, the situation had reversed. American forces were ashore, advancing, taking German positions. The landing would succeed. But Bradley also understood the cost. He would later write that he was shaken by what had happened at Omaha, that the casualties were far heavier than anticipated, that the margin between success and failure had been perilously thin. For the soldiers on Omaha Beach, the first hour had been the longest hour of their lives. Those who survived would carry the memories forever. The sound of machine gun bullets striking the hull of their landing craft, the sight of friends falling in the surf, the smell of blood and explosives, the screams of wounded men, the exhaustion and terror and desperate courage required to cross that terrible beach and climb those deadly bluffs. June 6, 1904, at Omaha Beach, would become their defining moment, the experience against which everything else in their lives would be measured. Conclusion and reflection. The first hour at Omaha Beach stands as one of the most harrowing episodes in American military history. In 60 minutes, from 6:30 to 7:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, thousands of young American soldiers faced the most intense combat many humans have ever experienced. They waded through surf under machine gun fire. They crossed a beach swept by bullets and shell fragments. They climbed bluffs toward enemy positions that should have been destroyed by bombardment, but remained fully operational. They did this not because they were superhuman, but because they were soldiers, because their training and discipline and courage carried them forward, even when every instinct screamed to hide, to retreat, to surrender. What saved the landing at Omaha Beach was not the plan, which failed almost immediately. It was not the bombardment, which missed its targets. It was not the armor support, most of which was lost before reaching shore. What saved Omaha Beach was the individual initiative of junior leaders and common soldiers, sergeants who rallied their squads when all the officers were dead, privates who attacked machine gun nests alone because someone had to, medics who treated the wounded under fire, engineers who cleared obstacles while bullets whined past their heads, coxswains who brought their landing craft back again and again despite seeing other boats blown apart. But here is something that the survivors themselves would not learn for decades. A detail revealed through captured German records and post-war historical analysis that fundamentally changes how we understand that terrible morning. The Germans thought they had won. At approximately 8:00 a.m., 90 minutes after H-hour, Generalleutnant Dietrich Kreis assessed the battle based on reports from his strongpoint commanders. The evidence available to him suggested a defensive success, heavy American casualties, burning landing craft, troops pinned at the waterline. According to German military records captured after the war, reports from the 352nd Division sector indicated that the American assault appeared to have stalled. While historians debate the exact wording and timing of various German communications that morning, the documentary evidence suggests that for a crucial period, German commanders at multiple levels believed the American attack had been repulsed. This assessment was not unreasonable, given what Kreis knew at that moment. His forward observers reported that the beach was covered with American dead and burning vehicles. Landing craft were being destroyed as they approached shore. The Americans who had made it to the seawall appeared pinned down, unable to advance. From the German perspective, the vaunted Allied invasion had crashed against the Atlantic wall and broken apart. This is what Rommel had promised: defeat the invasion at the water's edge. For a brief window of time, perhaps 30 minutes, German commanders at various levels believed they had achieved exactly that. Some strong point commanders reported American forces in full retreat. Artillery observers called in successful defensive fire missions. Based on the evidence available to them, looking down from their positions on the bluffs at a beach littered with American casualties, the Germans had every reason to believe they had won the Battle of Omaha Beach. And then, impossibly, the situation reversed. Within an hour of Kreis's victorious report, American soldiers began appearing on top of the bluffs behind German positions. Strong points that had been impregnable from the front were suddenly under attack from the flanks and rear. The carefully constructed defensive line began to collapse. By mid-afternoon, Kreis was sending very different reports: urgent requests for reinforcements, warnings that his division was in danger of being overwhelmed, admission that the Americans had broken through at multiple points. What happened in that hour between German confidence and German crisis reveals something profound about warfare and human nature. The soldiers on Omaha Beach did not know they were supposed to lose. They had not received the memo that their assault had been repulsed. When pinned down behind the seawall, when every attempt to advance seemed suicidal, when the plan had completely failed, they did not have the luxury of stopping to assess whether victory was still possible. They simply did what soldiers do. They kept fighting. And in doing so, they achieved something that looked impossible to everyone watching, including the enemy who thought he had already won. This is the hidden story of Omaha Beach, the counterintuitive truth that contradicts our assumptions about how battles are won and lost. We imagine that victory requires overwhelming force, perfect planning, technological superiority. Omaha Beach had none of these advantages in the first hour. The plan failed. The technology failed. The firepower failed. What did not fail was the refusal of individual soldiers to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. Historical analysis suggests that if the Germans had known how close they came to actually throwing the Americans back into the sea, if they had understood that at 8 a.m. the entire Omaha Beach landing hung by a thread, they might have committed their reserves differently. They might have counterattacked more aggressively. They might have reinforced Kreis's division in time to make a difference. But they believed they had already won, and by the time they realized their error, it was too late. The Americans had gained irreversible momentum. The lessons of Omaha Beach resonated through subsequent amphibious operations. The inadequacy of the preliminary bombardment led to changes in doctrine for later landings in the Pacific and in southern France. More time, more ships, and more shells would be allocated to pre-landing bombardment in future operations. The failure of the DD tanks in rough seas led to modifications in how armor would be employed in amphibious assaults. The high casualties among the first waves led to tactical changes in how assault troops would be organized and supported. But perhaps the most important lesson of Omaha Beach was about the resilience of soldiers under extreme conditions. Military plans are created in quiet offices by staff officers studying maps. They assume that events will unfold in predictable ways, that casualties will be manageable, that coordination will work. Omaha Beach demonstrated that when plans fail, when chaos reigns, when the situation seems hopeless, individual soldiers can still find ways to accomplish the mission. Not through some supernatural ability, but through ordinary courage applied in extraordinary circumstances. The men who fought at Omaha Beach did not think of themselves as heroes. In later years, when asked about their experiences, many would deflect praise. They would say they were just doing their job, just trying to survive, just following the man in front of them. They would talk about the friends they lost, the men who deserved recognition, but died in the surf or on the sand. They would express guilt that they survived while so many others did not. This humility is characteristic of combat veterans, especially those who experience the worst of war. But we can recognize what they perhaps could not fully acknowledge. Their actions on that June morning changed history. The successful landing at Omaha Beach, as costly and desperate as it was, opened the path to liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation. If Omaha Beach had failed, if the Germans had actually accomplished what they briefly believed they had accomplished, the entire D-Day operation would have been jeopardized. The British and Canadian beaches might have been isolated. The foothold in Normandy might have been too weak to sustain. The war in Europe would have been prolonged, with incalculable consequences. Today, Omaha Beach is peaceful. The sand where so many died is walked by tourists and families. The bluffs where German strongpoints once stood are covered with grass and memorials. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, overlooking the beach, holds more than 9,000 graves, row upon row of white marble crosses and stars of David. Many of the men buried there fell on June 6, 1944, in that first terrible hour. When we visit these places, when we look at those graves, we should remember not just the grand strategy and historical significance, but the individual moments of terror and courage. Remember the men from Bedford, Virginia, who left their small town and never returned. Remember the medics who gave their lives treating wounded under fire. Remember the tank crews that drowned when their DD tanks sank in the channel. Remember the sergeants who led their squads up the bluffs when all the officers were casualties. Remember the coxswains who steered their landing craft through obstacles and fire to get their soldiers to shore. Remember the engineers who cleared gaps through the beach obstacles, knowing they likely would not survive to see troops use them. These were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were not professional warriors or glory seekers. They were farmers, factory workers, students, clerks. They came from every corner of America, brought together by history and necessity. And in that first hour on Omaha Beach, they proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough and the cause is just. The legacy of Omaha Beach lives on, not in the strategic analysis or the after-action reports, but in the memory of sacrifice and courage. It lives on in the understanding that freedom is not free, that defeating evil sometimes requires young people to put their lives on the line. It lives on in the reminder that when Civilization itself is threatened when tyranny spreads, when darkness seems overwhelming. There are those who will stand and fight, who will wade through the surf and climb the bluffs and face the machine guns because they believe in something greater than themselves. And it lives on in the strange, powerful truth that sometimes victory comes not from knowing you can win, but from refusing to accept that you've lost. The Germans were certain they had won. The Americans had every reason to believe they would lose. And yet, somehow, impossibly, in those 60 minutes between 6:30 and 7:30 on the morning of June 6, 1944, history turned on the actions of soldiers who simply would not give up. As you think about the first hour at Omaha Beach, as you consider what those men endured and accomplished, take a moment to appreciate the world they fought to create. They fought for a future where such battles would not be necessary, where international law and cooperation would prevent the rise of tyrants like those they faced. That vision remains imperfect, unfulfilled. But it is worth pursuing, it is worth defending, and it is worth remembering the price that was paid on a beach in Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944. If you found this story meaningful, if it helped you understand something about courage, sacrifice, and the human capacity for endurance, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And perhaps, the next time you face a difficult challenge, remember the soldiers at Omaha Beach. Remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Remember that victory is not always determined by who has the best plan or the most resources. Sometimes it is determined by who refuses to quit when quitting seems like the only rational choice. Thank you for listening. May we never forget